Over the past 2 years, I have survived no fewer than 15 assassination attempts. The most recent, in April 2025, involved a coordinated effort to overthrow not just my government, but the will of the Burkinabé people. We have taken decisive action in light of these persistent and deadly threats. I confirm the presence of Russian special forces on our soil. This was a necessary and strategic decision to ensure the security of our institutions, our people, and our sovereignty. These forces are here to protect, not to interfere. They are supporting our military, training our personnel, and helping to shield us from those who seek to plunge our country into chaos. Burkina Faso will not fall. We are standing firm, and we are not standing alone.
Burkina Faso's leader, Ibrahim Traoré, survived 15 deadly assassination plots in 2 years, with the latest one that occurred in April 2025. And now Russian commandos are on the ground to protect him. But why would Russia intervene in such a delicate situation? Do they have a common enemy? Let's find that out. The political instability in Burkina Faso has reached a critical point, with a series of threats aimed directly at President Ibrahim Traoré's life and leadership. The recent failure of a major coup plot underscores the fragility of the situation. In response, Traoré has opted for a drastic measure: the deployment of Russian special forces to safeguard his regime and protect key government figures. This unexpected move raises important questions about Burkina Faso's shifting geopolitical alliances and the lengths to which Traoré is willing to go to secure himself from external threats. Traoré's government has been under siege from multiple directions. Since taking power in September 2022, the young leader has faced a relentless wave of internal opposition and external pressure. The country has become a battlefield for insurgent groups, many of whom operate with relative impunity in the Sahel region. Further exacerbating an already volatile security situation, these groups seeking to expand their influence across West Africa have targeted Burkina Faso's government, hoping to capitalize on the country's political chaos. In addition, domestic factions within the military and political elite have repeatedly attempted to destabilize Traoré's regime, culminating in the recent coup attempt. The failed coup of April 2025 was a particularly significant threat to Traoré. Authority reports indicate that a well-coordinated plot involving both former and current military officers, as well as insurgent groups, aimed to storm the presidential palace. This coup was not only about seizing power, it was part of a broader strategy to dismantle the government that Traoré had worked. The details of the plot revealed a network of conspirators, some of whom had close ties to foreign actors seeking to control Burkina Faso's strategic assets. The plot's discovery was a shock, but it was just one in a series of failed attempts to remove Traoré from power. In the face of these repeated threats, the Burkinabe government had to take decisive action. Traoré recognized that the situation was dire, and that his survival, and by extension, the stability of Burkina Faso, depended on securing his leadership against both internal and external enemies. His decision to bring in Russian commandos was not made lightly, but it reflects the depth of the crisis and the urgency with which he had to respond. These commandos are trained and equipped to handle high-stakes security operations. Were deployed with one primary objective: to protect Traoré and ensure the continuity of his government. The Russian military presence in Burkina Faso is a significant development in the country's security landscape. These special forces are not just there for ceremonial protection. They are deeply involved in securing key figures within the government, fortifying critical infrastructure, and providing military expertise to local forces. The Russian commandos have been assigned to protect Traoré himself, as well as other high-ranking officials within his administration. Their presence has been strategically planned to prevent any future attempts on the president's life, and to ensure that any political or military opposition is swiftly dealt with. One of the key roles the Russian forces are playing is in training Burkina Faso's military personnel. The Russian commandos are imparting advanced tactical knowledge, counterintelligence techniques, and surveillance strategies that are vital to countering the growing threat of insurgents and internal conspirators. By working closely with the Burkinabe forces, the Russian commandos are helping to build a more resilient security apparatus that can withstand future challenges. This training has not only enhanced the capabilities of the local forces, but has also served as a symbol of the deepening ties between Burkina Faso and Russia. The deployment of Russian forces also signals a shift. In Burkina Faso's foreign relations, Traoré's decision to align with Russia, a nation with a growing presence in Africa, marks a dramatic departure from the country's historical reliance on Western support, particularly from France. For years, Burkina Faso had been part of the French-led counterinsurgency efforts in the Sahel, with French forces stationed in the country to combat insurgencies. However, the relationship between Burkina Faso and France had soured in recent years, with Traoré's government increasingly viewing French influence as a hindrance rather than a help the French withdraw from the region. Particularly in Mali, and the growing dissatisfaction with Western intervention and African affairs played a key role in Burkina Faso's shift toward Russia. On the other hand, has been more than willing to step in and offer support. Unlike Western nations, which often imposed conditions on military aid, Russia has positioned itself as a partner to African governments looking for autonomy from Western influence. Russia's involvement in Burkina Faso is not just about protecting Traoré. It is also about building a long-term strategic partnership by securing its presence in the Sahel. Russia is positioning itself as a key player in the region's future, particularly as African nations look to diversify their alliances and seek security solutions that don't come with political strings. The presence of special forces is also a statement about the changing dynamics in the Sahel. As Western powers continue to pull back from the region, Russia's influence is growing. Moscow has been increasing its footprint across Africa, offering military support, weapons, and training to various governments that are wary of Western intervention. The strategic value of Burkina Faso, located in the heart of the Sahel, is not lost on Russia. By aligning itself with Traoré, Russia is not only securing its position in Burkina Faso, but also expanding its influence across the broader region, making it a key partner in the battle against insurgent groups and Western-backed interventions. While the deployment of Russian commandos is a crucial step in securing Traoré's leadership, the broader implications for Burkina Faso's future are still uncertain. The country is still embroiled in a vicious cycle of insurgency and political instability, and the coming months will be crucial in determining whether the Russian support can help stabilize the regime. However, one thing is clear. The intervention of Russian forces marks a new chapter in Burkina Faso's history, one where the country is taking its security into its own hands and redefining its place in the global geopolitical landscape. Now the question is, does Russia really care about Traoré's security? If yes, why? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black Rebellion. Let's continue now. Burkina Faso's shift toward Russia is not just a strategic move driven by necessity. It is also a reflection of a broader geopolitical narrative where Burkina Faso is seeking to challenge the influence of Western powers, particularly former colonial forces like France. While the decision to align with Russia might seem surprising at first glance, it becomes clearer when considering the shared interest between the two nations, especially when it comes to the common enemy they both face in the form of Western interference and exploitation. One of the primary reasons for Burkina Faso's growing ties with Russia lies in the perception of the West as an untrustworthy partner, particularly in the context of Burkina Faso's internal struggles. Since the rise of Captain Ibrahim Traoré in 2022, the country has been besieged by repeated coup attempts, many of which have been attributed to external forces and Western-backed opposition within the military. The West has consistently been a source of political tension in Burkina Faso, particularly France, whose military presence in the region has often been viewed with suspicion. Many Burkinabés feel that France's influence has long been a tool for neo-imperial control over African nations, with little regard for the continent's sovereignty and self-determination. The West's failure to effectively support Burkina Faso in its battle against insurgencies is another factor contributing to the shift. Over the years, Western-backed counterinsurgency efforts, led by French forces under Operation Barkhane, have proven ineffective in curbing the spread of insurgent violence in the Sahel region, rather than bringing stability. The French military presence has often been met with local resistance, viewed by many as a foreign occupation, rather than a genuine effort to protect the region. In contrast, Russia's approach has been seen as more pragmatic, offering military support without the political strings attached. Russia's willingness to engage with African countries on equal terms, rather than imposing its political agenda, resonates with leaders like Traoré, those who see Russia as a partner in their quest for autonomy and sovereignty. Additionally, both Russia and Burkina Faso share a common adversary in the form of Western powers, who often intervene in African politics under the guise of promoting democracy, human rights, and stability to many African leaders. This rhetoric often masks an agenda of control, extraction of resources, and interference in domestic affairs. Russia, meanwhile, has consistently positioned itself as a counterbalance to the West's dominance, offering an alternative vision of global politics. Where Africa's sovereignty is respected by aligning with Russia, Burkina Faso is not only securing military assistance, but also sending a strong message to the West that African nations are no longer willing to be dictated to by former colonial powers. Another key factor in Burkina Faso's pivot toward Russia is the economic and strategic opportunities Russia provides. Russia has been increasingly active in Africa, investing in military training, natural resource extraction, and infrastructure development, as Burkina Faso is rich in resources, particularly gold. Russia's involvement could lead to significant economic benefits, ensuring that the country's wealth is utilized to strengthen the nation rather than enrich foreign powers. Russia has long had an interest in Africa, particularly in countries with vast natural resources, and has positioned itself as an alternative to Western economic exploitation. With this new partnership, Burkina Faso could benefit from investments in key sectors like mining, energy, and infrastructure, while also reducing its reliance on Western financial aid. There's also the question of identity and a desire to break free from the legacy of colonialism. For many African countries, Russia's historical role in opposing Western imperialism during the Cold War has cemented its image as a global power that understands the struggles of post-colonial nations. Russia, while no stranger to its controversial foreign interventions, presents itself as a partner who respects the sovereignty of African states and is willing to offer support without the hidden costs often associated with Western aid. This positioning resonates strongly with countries like Burkina Faso. They have long struggled with the weight of colonial legacies and the continuing influence of former colonial powers in their internal affairs. However, it's important to note that this alignment with Russia is also about more than just rejecting the West. It's about the pragmatics of survival in a deeply unstable region. Burkina Faso, like many other countries in the Sahel, has been left to face the threat of insurgencies with limited support from traditional Western allies. The country is in the midst of a security crisis, and the decision to embrace Russia is in many ways a reflection of the urgent need for external military assistance in securing the regime and the country as a whole. Russia's willingness to provide this support without the political conditionality, often imposed by Western powers, makes it an appealing option for Traoré and his government, who see this as a lifeline in a time of crisis. In addition, the increasing Russian presence in Burkina Faso signals a broader shift in the geopolitics of the Sahel, as Western countries, particularly France, withdraw from the region due to growing anti-colonial sentiment and local resistance. Russia is stepping in to fill the vacuum. Burkina Faso's alignment with Russia may set a precedent for other nations in the region, especially those seeking to distance themselves from Western interventions. This trend could spark a broader realignment in Africa as countries increasingly turn to Russia and China for support, shifting the balance of power in favor of non-Western powers, as Burkina Faso's political and security situation remains precarious. The future of Captain Ibrahim Traoré's regime hangs in the balance. Despite successfully thwarting multiple coup attempts, including the most recent, and bolstering his leadership with Russian military support, Traoré faces an uphill battle to maintain control over the country. The complex web of insurgencies, internal divisions, and international scrutiny creates a fragile environment where the stability of his government is continually at risk. The question now is whether Traoré can build on his successes, or whether the challenges ahead will overwhelm his efforts to secure Burkina Faso's future. One of the most pressing issues Traoré faces is the ongoing threat from insurgent groups operating in the Sahel. The country has seen a sharp increase in attacks on military, civilian, and government targets, contributing to the displacement of over 1 million people. These insurgencies have become a central challenge for Traoré's government, and despite his efforts to combat them, the security situation remains dire. The deployment of Russian forces, including the highly trained commandos sent to protect Traoré, is a direct response to these threats. However, the effectiveness of this foreign military intervention remains to be seen. While Russian forces have certainly provided immediate protection to Traoré and key government figures, the long-term security of the country relies on more than just external military support. Traoré's government must address the root causes of the insurgencies, including the lack of infrastructure, economic opportunity, and effective governance in the regions most affected by militant violence. Furthermore, the challenge of unifying the country is a major obstacle for Traoré since taking power. His government has faced significant opposition from various sectors of society, including political elites, military factions, and civil society groups. These divisions have been exacerbated by Burkina Faso's economic hardships, particularly the rising cost of living and the disruption of vital services due to the ongoing violence. While Traoré has enjoyed support from parts of the population, especially those disillusioned with the former government's ties to France and the West, his administration has struggled to win over the broader public. The internal political fragmentation is compounded by the historical legacy of military coups in Burkina Faso. The country has experienced frequent leadership changes, with the military playing a central role in shaping political power. This has created a culture of political instability where loyalty to the regime is often questioned and rival. Factions within the military seek to undermine one another. The recent failed coup attempt is a vivid reminder of these tensions. Despite Traoré's efforts to consolidate his power, the risk of further military opposition remains high. The loyalty of the armed forces, particularly the Presidential Guard, is essential for Traoré's survival, but the divisions within the military are difficult to overcome beyond the security and political challenges. Burkina Faso's economic situation presents a serious concern for Traoré's government. The country's economic growth has stagnated due to the escalating violence and the disruption of vital industries such as agriculture and mining. The country's gold resources, which have become a key part of its economic base, are also at the center of international disputes with accusations of corruption and mismanagement, undermining their potential to benefit the Burkina Faso people. Traoré's government must find a way to leverage these resources to promote long-term economic growth and development, while ensuring that they do not fall prey to foreign exploitation. Russia's involvement, however, could also create economic opportunities for Burkina Faso, especially in the mining sector. Russia has shown a strong interest in African resources, and its growing presence in the country could bring investments and support for key infrastructure projects. However, this would require Traoré's government to strike a delicate balance between benefiting from Russian support and maintaining control over its resources. The involvement of foreign powers in Burkina Faso's natural wealth has historically been a source of exploitation, and Traoré must ensure that this does not become a new avenue for external influence over the country's economy. On the international stage, Traoré's alignment with Russia is not without risks. While Russia has provided military support and offered an alternative to Western-backed interventions, the geopolitical ramifications of this shift could have significant consequences. Western countries, particularly France, have expressed concern over Burkina Faso's growing ties with Moscow, with some accusing Traoré of aligning with a power that has its own interests in Africa. As Western powers reconsider their engagements in the region, particularly in the wake of rising Chinese and Russian influence, Burkina Faso's decision to pivot away from France could further isolate the country. Traoré must carefully navigate these tensions, ensuring that his alignment with Russia does not lead to further diplomatic fallout with the West, especially as the country still requires international aid and development assistance to stabilize its economy. Despite the mounting challenges, there are opportunities for Traoré to build a more resilient Burkina Faso. His government must focus on governance reforms that improve the lives of ordinary Burkinabé and address the underlying causes of discontent. This includes creating jobs, improving infrastructure, and addressing the human rights concerns that have plagued the country. Securing Burkina Faso's sovereignty while continuing to engage with international powers will be key to ensuring the country's future stability. Do you think Traoré's fixes can save Burkina Faso and keep him alive? Is he making a mistake? Let us know in the comments section. Can anyone defeat Traoré? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black Rebellion, civilization history, and evidence about how glorious blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.